In recent times, the major objective of Formula One's governing body is to create a closer grid where every team can perform on the same level and none will have an edge due to access to resources. The 2021 budget cap and the 2022 regulations are efforts to make that possible, but it is yet to yield the intended results. Many believe the 2023 season would be when the dream to have a more competitive grid would be actualized, but current signs hint at quite the opposite, and those expecting it might have a painful reality check. So what are these signs, and when would it be most likely to have a closed grid? Before 2022, new regulations had been introduced over the years to F1 to improve the performance of the cars. It took time for these regulations to yield the intended results, but people thought the 2022 regulations would be different. Recent signs show that history might repeat itself. The 2022 regulations are even more comprehensive than previous ones. They were created to improve the raceability of cars, but most importantly to ensure every team on the grid develops their car within a given scope. This is to ensure that no car has the edge over the other due to resources it can afford, and as a result, make motorsport more competitive. But it came with several challenges, technically and even financially. The teams need help to adapt to all the new aerodynamics guidelines. Also, the introduction of the budget cap in 2021 has yet to make things any easier. Despite the challenges, the FIA has stuck to the rules and only made slight alterations, like raising the floor edges to fix the porpoising rules, because they believe the rules will soon yield a positive result. In fact, they showed that they meant business in the 2022 season. The F1 teams Mercedes and Aston Martin had developed front and rear wings, which were not exactly against the rules, but it gave them an edge over the other cars on the grid, and the FIA took action. Although the addition had been quite innovative, the FIA found out that it went against the intent of their new regulations, so they made it illegal for the 2023 season. As mentioned earlier, the budget cap has also made things more difficult, especially for money teams. Usually, money teams like Mercedes and Ferrari would toss money around till they get the perfect car that would serve their purpose, but with the new budget cap it's quite impossible to do that. One can even see how the teams struggled to gain footing for the 2022 season. Besides the budget cap, the FIA also made a Concord agreement covering 2021 to 2025 to ensure that the 10 teams on the grid got an adequate share of the revenue. This thereby closed the door to extra funding for some teams. Another regulation that was created to ensure a more competitive grid were the aerodynamic testing regulations, or ATR. This regulation limits wind tunnel and CFD testing based on your performance. The priority is given to lower performance teams, and top teams get less. All these regulations are bound to make the grid more competitive, but its effect wasn't seen in the 2022 season. In fact, the season wasn't competitive, as a winner had already been known before the season had ended. But many people concluded that the regulation would significantly affect the 2023 season because the teams would have better adjusted to the regulations. Although it's quite possible due to all the steps the teams are taking to make their performance better than the previous season, historic trends show otherwise. Let's take a drive back in time to understand these trends better. We'll start from 1983. In 1983, the flat bottom rules that banned ground effect cars were made and created to have a tighter grid. That season, Ferrari had emerged on top of the Constructors' Championship, while Nelson Piquet of the Brabham team won the driver's title, which showed a bit of competitiveness. But it was just between a few teams. The grid got a bit closer the next year, but it was just between two top teams, Brabham and McLaren. Other teams on the grid were barely competing, thereby not yielding the intended results of the regulations. The next year to be considered is 1989. That year, a ban on turbo engines was made. This was because several teams were already using normally aspirated engines, and those that weren't were less competitive. That year, no significant result was yielded, as McLaren Honda's top spot remained uncontested. But the second year showed a significant improvement. The competition between Ferrari, the second top team, and McLaren tightened, and the other top 5 teams were also competitive. In 1994, another rule was revealed, and this was even more comprehensive than the previous ones mentioned. The electronic gizmo ban had active suspension and traction control, among others, made illegal. That year, Williams had the fastest car on the track, while Michael Schumacher of the Benetton team won his first driver's title. This shows a bit of competition between the two top teams. The next year, the competition level increased and was equally spread among the top 10 teams. Other teams struggled, but the significant increase in the level of competitiveness showed that there was progress. In 1998, new features such as narrow track cars and grooved tires were introduced. Nothing significant happened that year as regards to competitiveness, so there's nothing to be discussed there. And unfortunately, the following season was not any different. In fact, it was worse as McLaren, one of the top teams, made several errors and Ferrari's Michael Schumacher broke his leg. The new regulation's intended result was not seen until about 3 years after it was introduced. In 2006, there was a switch to 2.4-litre engines, and this didn't immediately yield any significant results. Although it had a bit of an impact in the second season after the introduction, it was nothing too significant. In 2009, the skinny aerodynamic regulations were introduced. The top 10 teams could perform as expected, and the competition levels were quite high. The next year, the impact of the regulations was even more significant despite several factors like Lotus Racing being a new brand, Sauber becoming independent again, and the ban on customers' cars that affected Toro Rosso trying to hinder the effectiveness of the regulation. A year to also be considered was 2014, when the 1.6-litre VG turbo engine was introduced. This year brought the Mercedes team to the limelight. They easily dominated the grid due to the new feature and barely had any competition. The next year wasn't any better as Mercedes stayed ahead and the gap in the performance of the teams became even wider. The last years to be considered are 2017 and 2018. In 2017, F1 introduced wider cars that generated more downforce and wider tyres. It barely made any difference in competitiveness, just like in 2014. 2018 was also the same, and maybe the only significant change was that the last teams on the grid, Sauber and Williams, competed on who should be the last. From all the years mentioned, you can see that there is sort of a trend as regards to the effect of new regulations. The first 2 years a new regulation is introduced is basically about the teams trying to adapt. The second season after the introduction of a new regulation might show a bit of improvement, but most times it's barely significant. This makes the idea of a dramatic shift in the competitiveness of the 10 teams on the grid highly unlikely, especially because the 2022 regulation is way more comprehensive than the previous regulations, and let's also not forget that several other factors affect the effectiveness of these regulations, such as the budget cap, the Concord Agreement, and so on. Another solid reason not to expect a more competitive grid is that most teams have their sights on greater achievement than getting ahead in the 2023 season. Teams like McLaren and Alpine have stated their plans to become regular frontrunners, and in the plan, the 2023 season is not a major focus. Other teams like Aston Martin and Sauber Alfa Romeo also have conditions holding them back from being very competitive next season. Aston Martin is moving into a new factory and is expecting a new wind tunnel, while Alfa Romeo is more focused on preparing for 2026 when it will become the Audi Works team. Although Mercedes and Ferrari have taken several steps to make the championship title less accessible to the Red Bull team, there are chances that it might not yield the intended results, and this will mean less competitiveness, just like in 2022. So anyone thinking that there will be a closer grid in 2023 should probably not have very high hopes, as the new regulations are difficult to incorporate. The 2024 season might be the season the close grid everyone wants will become a reality. So what do you think about the possibility of a closer grid in 2023? Be sure to let us know down below in the comments. Thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.